what is prosopagnosia?
Prosopagnosia is also known as face blindness. And basically, I just can't tell people apart. Everyone looks the same to me. And it's really interesting because and most people who have it do not realize that we have it, because you just don't realize how good other people are at recognizing faces. But neurotypical people have a weirdly super good memory for faces. And you don't realize that either, because all you have is your own experience. But neurotypical people, if you were at a cocktail party and you meet someone and talk to them for 5 minutes and then run into that same person the next day, like you guys you will probably recognize that person. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I resonate with that completely. Yeah.
That's amazing to me, because I mean, if I showed you a rock and then asked you to pick that rock out of a lineup the next day, there's no way you would be able to do it, right?
Right.
Yeah, but most people have a whole chunk of brain that's like the size of an almond, that's a little bit above each of your ears, that is devoted 100% to face recognition. And it's very unusual for any part of the brain to be that specialized. And so humans evolved this like near photographic memory for faces, but not so much me. I missed that step in the evolution.
Yeah. So what age were you when you found out that you had this?
It was a few years ago. I was 39.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And we'll get into the whole story of that, because I think it's a phenomenally interesting story, and in the step-by-step process and how you actually arrive at that official diagnosis, all the struggles that you had. But let's go into the neuroscience first. Let's dive into what is happening in the brain there let's just start with facial processing to start, and then maybe the lack of facial processing that's occurring in cases of prosopagnosia.
Well, the way that the brain processes faces is very weird. It seems that our brain actually like snips out any face you see in the sort of environment. Your brain sort of like snips it out for further analysis, splits it in half, sends the left half to the right hemisphere for processing, and vice versa, and then brings the two halves of that face back together in your right hemisphere. Sorry, that's this one. And then like that, it's this very like weird, tortured way of sort of analyzing faces. And there was another study, I'm trying to remember the number of dimensions, but basically your brain like plots faces on, I wish I remember the number.
50 in your book, I think you say 50, a 50-dimensional space. Is that right?
Thank you for remembering. Yeah. 50-dimensional face plot. And basically at the center of that, 50-dimensional sort of space is a archetypical face, like the most average of all the faces you've seen, maybe not in your whole life, but in some developmentally critical time period.
Right. Very interesting. And what might be an example of a dimension, like the width between eyes, the height of the cheekbones? Are these all sort of typical dimensions that might go into that?
It's very hard to sort of name them when you sort of decompose it. But I remember the researcher said like face texture, like the smooth or roughness of skin was one of them. It also, one of the things that mapped onto one of the dimensions was, eye like distance from each other, your eye width distance and that kind of thing. But really interesting about faces, and the thing that's sort of still mysterious to researchers, is the fact that we see them very holistically, or at least neurotypical people see them very holistically. So if you look at a face upside down, it is not going to hang together the same way. Like you're a lot slower to recognize celebrities or people if the face is upside down. So if you want to know what it's like to be me, in some way, you could just look at a celebrity face upside down and be like, who is that? And probably it will take you longer to recognize that person.
It's incredible. It's impossible to conceive of, right? As you mentioned, it's equally inconceivable to you that we can notice all these faces than it is for us that you can't, because this is the only one experience that we each live. That's why this whole thing is so interesting to me.
Yeah. And I do think that I mean, I suspect that there's a qualitative difference to how I see faces compared to neurotypical people. I mean, for one thing, my whole world is very flat because I also am stereo blind, which is something else I discovered quite late in the game. I did not realize that I was living in a two-dimensional, like, paper cutout world, that and everyone
Right.
else in a 3D world. And when I found out, it was like, oh, that's why I can't, like, thread a needle or catch a softball.
Right. So you're explain that a little bit more. That's related to your depth perception, is that correct?
Yeah. So basically, first I discovered I was face blind, and then it made me think, like, what else don't I know about myself, and by extension, everyone else, right? Because we all assume that our perception and our cognitive experience is basically normal, right?
Yeah.
But I was very wrong, and I think there's a lot more variety in the human conscious experience than anyone realized. So anyway, so in answer to your question, yeah. So I was like, well, okay, I'm face blind. Why am I face blind? It's usually quite genetic, but everyone in my family is very good at recognizing faces. So I discovered, probably for me, it comes from the fact that I'm stereo blind, which is something I
Ah,
didn't. Yeah. And so basically my brain, I only look out of one eye at a time. So I'm looking out of my left eye and now right eye, left eye, right eye. Like, so isn't that weird? Um,
right.
and I, again, didn't really understand that other people's worlds do not suddenly just like jump like 2 inches to the left all the time, or, to the right.
Wow.
My brain like sort of papers over the switch, like, but it's still perceptible. And people like me, I can't remember how, we're actually like fairly common. And people don't realize it, again, because you don't realize that other people's worlds are so much plumper than ours, where space is palpable. And people who have learned to see in 3D as adults say that it's amazing. They say that it's almost like the world inflates, like, with new space, and trees
Wow.
become trees become like beautiful sculptures, like, that people ever you sort of become a child again. So I really was trying to learn to see in 3D, and I had some success, but nothing spectacular.
If you enjoyed that short podcast clip, then be sure to click on the full podcast that you can watch here.